Harlem, 1948. The emergency room at St. Luke's Hospital. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Bumpy Johnson sat in the corner of the waiting room, his mother's hand growing colder in his. Mrs. Johnson's breathing was shallow, labored. Every few seconds she'd squeeze his fingers with what little strength she had left. "Please," Bumpy had said to the receptionist an hour ago. "My mother needs help." The woman behind the desk barely looked up. "You'll have to wait like everyone else." But this wasn't about waiting. This was about something else entirely. Dr. Harrison walked past them for the third time, his white coat pristine, his nose held high. He glanced at Bumpy and his dying mother, then kept walking. The message was clear as day. Your kind doesn't belong here. The other patients in the waiting room, all white, had been seen. Some came in after the Johnsons, but they were taken back immediately. A man with a minor cut on his finger, a woman complaining of a headache, even a child with nothing more than a runny nose. But Mrs. Johnson, she could die in that chair for all they cared. To understand what happened that night, you need to go back 6 months earlier, when Bumpy Johnson was still building his empire in the streets of Harlem. Back then he was known for two things: his brilliant mind and his unshakable moral code. The streets respected him not because he was the most violent, but because he was the most intelligent. And because when Bumpy gave his word, it was bond. See, Bumpy understood something that most people didn't. Power wasn't about how loud you could shout or how hard you could hit. Real power was about knowing exactly when to speak and exactly when to stay silent. It was about reading people like open books and playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. But on this particular night, watching his mother struggle to breathe while Dr. Harrison ignored them, Bumpy felt something he hadn't felt in years. Helplessness. The kind of rage that burns cold instead of hot. Dr. Harrison was well known throughout Manhattan's medical community. Harvard educated, family money going back 3 generations. He'd built his reputation on being the best heart specialist on the East Side. Politicians, business moguls, even celebrities, they all wanted Dr. Harrison when their hearts were failing them. But Dr. Harrison had a problem. He believed that his medical expertise came with the right to choose who deserved to live and who deserved to die. And in his mind, people like the Johnsons fell into the second category. "Doctor?" Bumpy called out as Harrison passed by again. His voice was calm, steady, the same tone he used when he was about to make someone an offer they couldn't refuse. "My mother needs your help." Dr. Harrison stopped, turned around. For a moment, it looked like he might actually acknowledge them. Then his face twisted into something ugly. "I don't treat your people," he said loud enough for the entire waiting room to hear. "Perhaps you should try the clinic downtown. They're more accommodating to your situation." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the other patients looked uncomfortable. But Bumpy didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't even stand up. Instead, he did something that made Dr. Harrison's blood run cold. He smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a bitter smile. The kind of smile that meant Bumpy Johnson had just added your name to a very special list. The kind of list you didn't want to be on. "I understand," Bumpy said quietly. "You're a busy man." Dr. Harrison seemed confused by the calm response. He'd expected anger, maybe even violence. That's what he'd been prepared for. But this quiet acceptance, it threw him off balance. "Well, yes, exactly. I'm sure you understand." "Oh, I do." Bumpy's smile never wavered. "I understand completely." As Dr. Harrison walked away, probably thinking he'd just put another uppity black man in his place, he had no idea that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because what Dr. Harrison didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson never forgot a face, never forgot a name, and most importantly, never forgot a debt. Mrs. Johnson squeezed her son's hand one more time. "Bumpy," she whispered, "don't do anything foolish." "Don't worry, Mama," he said, still watching Dr. Harrison disappear down the hallway. "I'm going to handle this the smart way." But as he sat there calculating his next move with the precision of a master strategist, one thing was becoming crystal clear. Dr. Harrison thought he was untouchable, that his position, his reputation, his skin color made him invincible. He was about to learn just how wrong he was 20 minutes later. Mrs. Johnson's condition was getting worse. Her lips had turned a pale blue and her breathing came in short, desperate gasps. The other patients in the waiting room were starting to stare, some with sympathy, others with that uncomfortable look people get when they witness injustice but don't want to get involved. Bumpy stood up slowly. His movements were deliberate, calculated. He walked to the reception desk where the same woman sat, now pretending to be very busy with paperwork that hadn't been there an hour ago. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Could you please page Dr. Harrison again? My mother is dying." The receptionist didn't even look up. "I told you already. You'll have to wait your turn." "Ma'am," Bumpy's voice remained calm, respectful even. "With all due respect, we've been waiting for over an hour while you've seen 12 other patients. My mother needs medical attention now." That's when Dr. Harrison reappeared, having overheard the conversation, but instead of showing any concern, he looked annoyed, as if Bumpy's politeness was somehow more offensive than if he'd been angry. "Listen here," Dr. Harrison said, stepping close enough that Bumpy could smell the expensive cologne and coffee on his breath. "I already told you once I don't treat people like you. This is a respectable hospital, not some charity clinic in the ghetto." The words hung in the air like poison. Several patients gasped. A nurse walking by stopped dead in her tracks. Even the receptionist looked up, clearly uncomfortable with how far her colleague was pushing this. But Bumpy just nodded slowly as if Dr. Harrison had just explained something perfectly reasonable. "I see," he said quietly. "People like me." "That's right. Now, I suggest you take your mother somewhere more appropriate, before security has to escort you out." Here's what Dr. Harrison thought he was doing. He thought he was putting an uppity black man in his place. He thought he was showing everyone in that waiting room who held the power. He thought he was proving that no matter how politely Bumpy spoke, or how much money he had in his pocket, there were still lines he couldn't cross. What Dr. Harrison didn't understand was that he'd just made 3 critical errors. First, he'd shown his hand completely. Bumpy now knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Not just prejudiced, but cruel. Not just ignorant, but vindictive. The kind of man who would let an innocent woman die just to prove a point. Second, he'd done it publicly, in front of witnesses, in front of his own staff. That meant there were people who would remember this moment, people who might not agree with what they'd just seen. Third, and most importantly, he'd underestimated who he was talking to. See, Dr. Harrison looked at Bumpy and saw what most white people in 1948 saw when they looked at a black man in a nice suit. Uppity, out of place, someone who needed to be reminded of his station. But what Dr. Harrison failed to recognize was that he was standing face to face with one of the most dangerous men in New York City. Not because Bumpy was violent, though he could be when necessary, but because Bumpy understood something that Dr. Harrison's privileged upbringing had never taught him. Information was power, patience was strength, and every man, no matter how untouchable he thought he was, had pressure points. "You know what, Doctor?" Bumpy said, pulling out his wallet. "You're absolutely right. This probably isn't the place for us." He peeled off several $100 bills, more money than most people in that room made in 3 months, and placed them gently on the reception desk. "This should cover a private ambulance to take my mother to Harlem Hospital. They'll know how to treat her there." Dr. Harrison's eyes widened at the sight of the money. Suddenly, the man he'd been dismissing as just another poor black patient was showing more cash than the doctor made in half a year. "Where did you," Harrison started to say, then caught himself. "Get this money?" Bumpy finished the question with that same calm smile. "I'm a businessman, Doctor. I provide services to people who need them, just like you do. The only difference is I don't choose my customers based on the color of their skin." The private ambulance arrived within minutes. As the paramedics carefully lifted Mrs. Johnson onto a stretcher, she grabbed her son's hand one more time. "Promise me," she whispered. Promise me you won't do anything that'll get you in trouble. Bumpy leaned down and kissed her forehead. Mama, I promise you, I'm not going to touch a hair on his head. Mrs. Johnson squeezed his hand, relief flooding her face. She didn't catch the exact wording of his promise. She didn't notice that he'd said he wouldn't touch Dr. Harrison physically. He'd said nothing about destroying the man in every other way possible. As the ambulance pulled away, Bumpy stood on the sidewalk outside St. Luke's Hospital. The night air was cold, but he felt warm, focused, energized in a way he hadn't felt in months. Dr. Harrison thought the story was over. He probably went back to his office, poured himself a scotch, and congratulated himself on putting another troublemaker in his place. He probably told his wife about it over dinner, how he'd stood his ground, how he'd shown them who was boss. What Dr. Harrison didn't know was that the real story was just beginning, because as Bumpy walked back to his car, he was already making phone calls, already setting wheels in motion, already gathering the kind of information that would make Dr. Harrison wish he'd never learned the name Johnson. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd humiliated him. They thought they'd sent him running with his tail between his legs. But Bumpy Johnson had just learned everything he needed to know about his enemy. And in the game of chess he was about to play, Dr. Harrison had just moved his king into check, without even realizing it. Block 3. The strategy. 3 days later. Harlem. Mrs. Johnson was alive. The doctors at Harlem Hospital had worked through the night and she was going to make it. But as Bumpy sat by her bedside watching her sleep peacefully for the first time in days, he wasn't thinking about gratitude. He was thinking about justice. See, most people would have been satisfied with their mother's recovery. They would have chalked up Dr. Harrison's behavior to ignorance and moved on with their lives. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most people. He understood something that Dr. Harrison would never understand. When you let a man humiliate you publicly and walk away without consequences, you're not just accepting defeat for yourself. You're accepting it for every person who looks like you, talks like you, or comes from where you come from. That night, while his mother slept, Bumpy made a call to someone very special, someone who understood the game better than anyone else in the city. Malcolm, he said into the phone. I need a favor. Malcolm Torres wasn't your typical private investigator. He was a former police detective who'd gotten tired of watching guilty rich men walk free while innocent poor men went to prison. When he quit the force, he didn't quit fighting for justice. He just changed his methods. Malcolm was also the only Puerto Rican investigator who could move through both the white establishment world and the streets with equal ease. He spoke their language, understood their customs, and most importantly, he knew where all the bodies were buried. What do you need, hermano? Malcolm's voice was gravelly from too many years of cigarettes and late nights. Dr. Theodore Harrison, St. Luke's Hospital. I need to know everything. Where he goes, who he talks to, what he's afraid of. Everything. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Malcolm had worked with Bumpy before. He knew that when Bumpy Johnson asked for information on someone, it meant that person had made a very serious mistake. How deep you want me to dig? All the way to hell if that's where the truth is hiding. What happened over the next 2 weeks was a masterclass in strategic warfare. While Dr. Harrison went about his daily routine completely unaware that his life was being dissected piece by piece, Malcolm worked his magic. He followed Harrison to his private club, where the doctor bragged about putting a uppity Negro in his place to anyone who would listen. He documented Harrison's gambling debts. The man owed $30,000 to some very unfriendly people in Atlantic City. But the real treasure came when Malcolm discovered Harrison's dirty little secret. See, Dr. Harrison wasn't just a racist. He was a fraud. For the past 3 years, he'd been billing insurance companies for procedures he never performed. Heart surgeries that existed only on paper. Consultations that never happened. He'd been stealing from sick people, lining his own pockets while families went bankrupt paying for treatments their loved ones never received. Malcolm brought the evidence to Bumpy on a cold Thursday morning. File folders full of forged documents, fake billing records, and testimony from nurses who'd been too afraid to speak up. This goes deeper than I thought, Malcolm said, spreading the papers across Bumpy's kitchen table. He's not just stealing from individuals. He's stealing from the government, insurance companies, even charity funds meant for poor patients. Bumpy studied the documents with the focus of a lawyer preparing for the biggest case of his career. Every number told a story. Every signature revealed another lie. How much are we talking about? Conservative estimate? $200,000 over 3 years. In 1948, that was enough money to buy a dozen houses in the best neighborhood in Manhattan. It was the kind of money that could destroy a man's life, his family, and his future with a single phone call to the right authorities. But Bumpy didn't make that phone call. Not yet. Instead, he did something that Malcolm didn't expect. He started making different calls. To people Dr. Harrison would never suspect. To sources the arrogant doctor didn't even know existed. First, he called Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the wife of Judge Whitman, one of the most powerful men in Manhattan's legal system. Mrs. Whitman had been trying to get pregnant for 12 years. She'd seen Dr. Harrison 6 months ago for a consultation about a heart condition that might complicate pregnancy. Mrs. Whitman, Bumpy said politely when she answered the phone. This is Mr. Johnson. I have some information about Dr. Harrison that I think you should know. Next, he called Councilman Patrick Murphy, whose elderly father had recently died under Dr. Harrison's care. The family had always suspected something wasn't right about the treatment, but they'd never had proof. Then came the call to Mrs. Rose Goldman, whose husband owned the largest insurance company in New York. The same company that Dr. Harrison had been systematically defrauding for years. One by one, Bumpy planted seeds. Not accusations, not threats, just information, just truth delivered to people who had the power to do something about it. But the most important call went to someone Dr. Harrison trusted completely. Someone who worked right beside him every single day. Nurse Patricia Collins had been working at St. Luke's for 15 years. She'd seen Dr. Harrison's behavior that night with Mrs. Johnson, and it had sickened her. She'd wanted to speak up, but she needed her job. She had 3 children to feed and a mortgage to pay. When Bumpy called her at home that evening, his voice was gentle, respectful. Miss Collins, my name is Bumpy Johnson. I believe you were working the night my mother was denied treatment by Dr. Harrison. Patricia's voice was barely a whisper. I remember. I'm so sorry about what happened. It was wrong. Miss Collins, what if I told you there was a way to make sure Dr. Harrison never hurt another patient again? Would you be interested in hearing about it? By the time Bumpy hung up the phone, Nurse Patricia Collins had agreed to do something that would change everything. She was going to start keeping records. Every fake procedure, every forged document, every lie Dr. Harrison told, she was going to document it all. Dr. Harrison had no idea that the woman who brought him his coffee every morning, who scheduled his appointments, who trusted him with her career, was now working for the man he'd humiliated in his waiting room. As Bumpy sat in his mother's hospital room that night watching her color return to normal, he felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child. The calm satisfaction that comes from knowing justice is on its way. Dr. Harrison thought he was untouchable. He thought his position, his connections, his skin color made him invincible. He was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one you never see coming. 6 weeks after the incident, St. Luke's Hospital, Board of Directors meeting. Dr. Harrison walked into the mahogany-paneled boardroom with the confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences in his life. He straightened his tie, smoothed back his graying hair, and took his usual seat at the right hand of the hospital director. Today was supposed to be routine, budget discussions, staff evaluations, maybe some talk about the new wing they were planning to build with all that insurance money flowing in. What Dr. Harrison didn't know was that 3 of the 7 board members had received very interesting phone calls over the past month. Calls from people they trusted. People with information that made their blood run cold. Before we begin today's agenda, said Director Morrison, a thin man whose family had founded the hospital 60 years ago, we have a serious matter to address. Dr. Harrison barely looked up from his notes. He was mentally rehearsing his presentation about expanding the cardiac wing. More beds meant more procedures meant more money. Theodore, Morrison continued, his voice taking on a tone that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. We've received some disturbing allegations about your billing practices. That's when Dr. Harrison's head snapped up. For the first time in weeks, he felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Fear. I'm sorry, what allegations? Morrison opened a thick manila folder. The same folder that Nurse Patricia Collins had been secretly filling for 6 weeks. Every forged signature, every fake procedure, every stolen dollar, documented with the precision of a forensic accountant. It appears you've been billing for procedures that never took place. Heart surgeries performed on patients who were never actually operated on. Consultations that exist only on paper. Dr. Harrison's mouth went dry. His hands started to shake, just slightly, enough for the other board members to notice. That's ridiculous. Where are you getting this information? From multiple sources, actually, said Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the judge's wife, who was sitting directly across from him. Sources who've been watching you very carefully. Here's what Dr. Harrison still didn't understand. He thought this was about money. He thought maybe someone had noticed some irregularities in his billing and he could smooth it over with explanations and charm. He had no idea this was about justice. He had no idea this was about a promise Bumpy Johnson had made to his dying mother. Now, Theodore, Morrison continued, these are very serious accusations. Federal charges serious. Prison time serious, but before we involve the authorities, we wanted to give you a chance to explain. Dr. Harrison's mind was racing. How had they found out? He'd been so careful, so methodical. The only person who had access to all those records was. His blood turned to ice. Patricia, Nurse Patricia Collins, the mousy little woman who brought him coffee every morning and stayed late every night to help with his paperwork. She'd been in his office dozens of times, had access to his files, his billing records, his signature stamps. Patricia Collins has been very cooperative, Mrs. Whitman said, as if reading his thoughts. Very detailed in her record keeping. Apparently, she's been documenting every irregularity for quite some time now. The room was spinning. Dr. Harrison loosened his tie, trying to breathe. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not to Theodore Harrison, Harvard graduate, respected physician, pillar of the community. There's more, Morrison said, pulling out another folder. This one even thicker than the first. It seems you've also been involved in some very interesting conversations at the Union Club. Conversations about your views on which patients deserve treatment and which don't. Dr. Harrison's blood pressure spiked. The Union Club was supposed to be private, sacred. What happened at the club stayed at the club. That was the gentleman's agreement. Several members have come forward, Mrs. Whitman continued. They found your recent bragging about denying treatment to a black woman quite disturbing. That's when Dr. Harrison realized he wasn't just facing financial ruin. He was facing social destruction, professional annihilation, the complete and total dismantling of everything he'd built over 30 years of practice. Gentlemen, please, he said, his voice cracking for the first time. Surely we can work something out. I can pay back any discrepancies. I can issue apologies for any misunderstandings. Misunderstandings? The voice came from the back of the room. Dr. Harrison turned around, and his face went white as hospital sheets. Standing in the doorway, wearing an impeccably tailored suit and holding a leather briefcase, was Bumpy Johnson. Calm, composed, smiling that same terrifying smile from 6 weeks ago. Mr. Johnson, Morrison said, standing up respectfully. Thank you for joining us. My pleasure, Mr. Morrison. I appreciate you taking my concerns so seriously. Dr. Harrison's world tilted on its axis. Bumpy Johnson was here in the boardroom, being treated with respect by people who wouldn't have given him the time of day 6 weeks ago. Your concerns? Dr. Harrison's voice was barely a whisper. Oh, yes, Bumpy said, setting his briefcase on the table and opening it slowly. See, Doctor, when you refused to treat my dying mother, you made this personal. And when something becomes personal with me, I don't just get mad. I get thorough. He pulled out a stack of photographs. Pictures of Dr. Harrison at illegal gambling dens in Atlantic City. Pictures of him meeting with known criminals to arrange payment plans for his debts. Pictures that would destroy him even faster than the fraud charges. "I believe these belong to you," Bumpy said, sliding the photos across the table. Dr. Harrison stared at the images, his hands shaking uncontrollably now. His secret life, his hidden shame, laid bare for everyone to see. How did you get these?" Bumpy's smile never wavered. "Doctor, you spent so much time looking down on people like me, you forgot something important. We see everything, we know everyone, and we never, ever forget." The boardroom was dead silent. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall. You could hear Dr. Harrison's labored breathing. You could practically hear his career crashing down around him. "The question now," Morrison said, "is what happens next." Bumpy closed his briefcase and stood up slowly. "That's entirely up to Dr. Harrison. He can resign quietly, seek treatment for his gambling addiction, and maybe, avoid federal prosecution. Or he can continue to pretend he's untouchable and see what happens when all of this becomes public." Dr. Harrison looked around the room at faces that had once respected him, feared him, envied him. Now they looked at him like he was something they'd scraped off their shoes. I need time to think. Need time to—" "You have until 5 o'clock today," Morrison said firmly. "Your resignation letter or we call the FBI. Your choice." As Bumpy walked toward the door, he paused next to Dr. Harrison's chair. He leaned down and spoke so quietly that only the doctor could hear. "My mother is doing fine, by the way, thanks for asking." Dr. Harrison thought he was untouchable. He thought his privilege was armor and his prejudice was power. But he'd just learned the most important lesson of his life. When you humiliate a man like Bumpy Johnson, you don't just make an enemy. You create your own destruction. 5 o'clock came and went. Dr. Harrison never showed up to deliver his resignation letter. Instead, at 5:47 p.m., security found him in his office, slumped over his desk with an empty bottle of scotch and a half-written confession that would never be finished. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but everyone who knew the real story understood what had actually killed Theodore Harrison. Shame. The man who had spent his entire career deciding who lived and who died had discovered that some fates are worse than death. The prospect of losing everything, his reputation, his freedom, his family's respect, had proven too much for his privileged heart to bear. When the news broke the next morning, the headlines told only part of the story. Prominent doctor dies suddenly. Cardiac specialist suffers fatal heart attack. The newspapers mentioned his charitable work, his medical achievements, his standing in the community. They didn't mention the fraud investigation. They didn't mention the gambling debts. They didn't mention the night he let a black woman nearly die in his waiting room just to prove a point about power. But in Harlem, they knew the truth. And in the barber shops, the jazz clubs, the corner stores where real stories get told, they talked about the night Bumpy Johnson taught the whole city a lesson about respect. See, what happened to Dr. Harrison wasn't just about one racist doctor getting his comeuppance. It was about something bigger. Something that would echo through the halls of every hospital, every courthouse, every boardroom in Manhattan. Word spread quickly through the medical community. Nurse Patricia Collins, who had risked everything to document Harrison's crimes, found herself with job offers from 3 different hospitals, all of them eager to hire the woman who had shown such integrity under pressure. The board at St. Luke's Hospital implemented new policies overnight. Mandatory sensitivity training, oversight committees, review boards to ensure that every patient, regardless of race or economic status, received the same standard of care. But the real change happened in the streets, because what Bumpy Johnson had done wasn't just brilliant, it was revolutionary. He hadn't used violence, hadn't broken any laws, hadn't even raised his voice. He'd simply used the system against itself, turned the establishment's own rules and connections into weapons of justice. Other men in Harlem started paying attention, started taking notes, started realizing that sometimes the most powerful response to humiliation isn't retaliation, it's education. Not just your own education, but educating your enemies about the consequences of their actions. Mrs. Johnson made a full recovery. She lived another 23 years, long enough to see her son become one of the most respected men in New York City. Long enough to watch him build an empire based not on fear or violence, but on intelligence and strategic thinking. And every year, on the anniversary of that night at St. Luke's Hospital, Bumpy would visit her grave and tell her the same thing. "I kept my promise, Mama. I never laid a finger on him. Didn't have to." The story of Dr. Harrison became legend in certain circles, a cautionary tale whispered in country clubs and medical conferences, a reminder that privilege without character is just vulnerability in disguise, that reputation built on prejudice can crumble faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. But for Bumpy Johnson, the real lesson was simpler and more profound. He learned that true power isn't about being feared. It's about being underestimated by your enemies while being respected by your allies. It's about understanding that every person you meet knows something you don't, has connections you need, or possesses information that could change your life. Dr. Harrison made the classic mistake of powerful men throughout history. He assumed that because he couldn't see Bumpy's network, it didn't exist. He assumed that because he didn't understand Bumpy's methods, they weren't dangerous. He assumed that because he held the institutional power, he held all the power. He was wrong on every count. The game of chess that started in that hospital waiting room didn't end with checkmate. It ended with resignation. Not the letter Dr. Harrison never wrote, but the deeper resignation that comes when a man realizes he's been outplayed by someone he never should have challenged. Years later, when young men in Harlem would ask Bumpy for advice about dealing with prejudice and humiliation, he would tell them the same thing every time. Never let anger make your decisions. Never let pride cloud your judgment. And never ever underestimate the power of patience combined with preparation. Because the man who can wait for the right moment while gathering the right information, that man is unstoppable. Today, if you walk through the halls of what used to be St. Luke's Hospital, now part of a larger medical system with strict anti-discrimination policies, you won't find any plaques or memorials to Dr. Theodore Harrison. His name has been quietly erased from the buildings he once walked through with such arrogance. But ask any old-timer in Harlem about the night Bumpy Johnson faced down the establishment and won without throwing a single punch, and you'll get a story that's been polished by decades of telling. A story about what happens when intelligence meets injustice. A story about the power of playing the long game. Because in the end, the men who think they're untouchable are always the easiest to bring down. They never see it coming. They never learn the lesson until it's too late. And they never understand that sometimes the quietest voice in the room belongs to the most dangerous man in the building.